Well, hi there, I'm Noah Bradley. This is Handmade House TV, and on today's episode, we're going to start a new series here on Handmade Houses, and it's going to be a four-parter where I'm going to share with you the 4 best species of wood to use when building your log home. So stay tuned. Well, all right, today we're going to focus on chestnut as being a wonderful species of wood in building your log home. But before I get started in that, since this is a 4-part series, I kind of want to also introduce the entire series. I hope that you'll listen to all 4 of them, but perhaps this will be the most important of all 4 of them. And that is that, for one thing, I'm constantly being asked, what's the best species of wood to use in building a log home? And my response is typically, well, that depends upon what's available to you, and that there is no ideal, there's no perfect species of wood to use in building a log cabin. Each one of them has pros and cons. And a lot of times, well, what's your favorite? What would you use in order to build a log cabin? And my response is typically, I don't have one, because there are pros and cons to each species of wood. And I get that look like, well, you really know what your favorite is. You really know what's the best one to use, but you're just not sharing it. Maybe we need to go sign up for the Handmade House Guild program and all your paid courses in order to find that out. But that's not true. And I'm hoping that through the course of these 4 videos that I'm going to share with you, you'll learn a better understanding of what that is. So let me cover a few basic points before we get started. The first one is obviously that there's no best species to use. They all have their pros and cons. The second one is that the best wood for you to use in constructing your log home is the best wood that you can obtain in your area, in your life, on the particular day that you're starting. If you're using the wood from your own property, then look around and see what your best option is. And if you're buying it from someone else, see what's available in the area. And what you're looking for primarily in choosing the logs for your log cabin is that you need them long enough to create your log home. You need them wide as possible. The wider your logs are, the taller your logs are. When you're looking at the profile of your log cabin, the more attractive your log home will go, the less pieces you'll have in it, the less notching you'll have to do, and just generally, the more attractive your log home will be. And then also another consideration when you're looking for that wood, not only do you want it as long as possible and as wide as possible, but you want it relatively knot-free. Knots encourage perhaps rot around where the knot is. They are very hard to work with if you're working with an axe or a hatchet, and especially if you're working around the notches. Sometimes knots fall out. But for me, it's one of those, I don't want my log cabin to look like a leopard. I don't want to see a lot of spots when I'm looking at it. So relatively tall trunks on a tree in order to do that. And then finally, you want to make sure that you don't have a twist in the tree. And you can tell by looking at the bark when you're standing at a tree and looking up and down the bottom of it, that the bark will twist just like the grain inside of it will. And the more of a twist you have in your bark, when you cut down that wood and put it on your log cabin, that twist is not going away. It wants to keep on moving and keep on twisting. So you want a relatively straight stretch in it and everything else. So a lot of times when I get emails from folks that are living in Colorado or Washington State or Alaska or Canada or even over in Europe, and they will ask me about species of wood to use that they have to choose from. And clearly, I don't have exposure to all of the woods in the world. So the woods that I'm going to share with you are the woods primarily focused in the mid-Atlantic here in Virginia. And how I chose these 4 is that historically, that's the 4 that I constantly find when I'm looking at historic log cabins, whether or not it's as far down as South Carolina or as far north as New York State, or as far west, in my own recollection, as far as west as Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. And my understanding is this continues all the way out to Arkansas and beyond, is these 4 primary types of wood. So today, the wood that I wanted to focus on is chestnut. Everybody loves chestnut. Chestnut, the word chestnut is just like gold. A lot of times that folks will get in touch with me and they'll want to sell me a barn or a log cabin or something another, and 90% of the time the description of those logs is chestnut, and that it was built in the 1700s, and that when I actually get on site, it ends up that it's late 1800s and it's almost never chestnut. And a lot of times the people, when they will buy something, they'll buy it with the impression, a vintage log cabin or something, that it is chestnut in 1700s, and they're so devastated when they hear that it's not chestnut and that it's not 1700s. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. A log cabin built in the late 1800s is just as wonderful, just as precious as one built in the 1700s. And chestnut is not the greatest wood in the world. And let's get into that. So what I'm going to do with each of these 4 videos on the species of wood to use in your log cabin, and I've broken down into various categories in order to better compare them with each other, and for considerations for you to have when you're building your log cabin. And I think that this will reveal to you the pros and cons of each particular species of wood. One attribute that perhaps the other 3 species that we're not going to cover with chestnut is availability. And clearly that's a consideration for you. There's no sense in you deciding that, say, you want to build out of oak, but oak doesn't grow in your neighborhood and you need to get it from 3 states over. I highly encourage everyone to use what is locally available for you when building your log cabin. So, and chestnut is no longer available, period, unless you buy it in a salvaged method. And that is that you're looking for a log cabin that has been carefully taken down, numbered, and ready for you to put back up. I highly recommend using salvaged wood whenever possible. Vintage logs from a previous standing log homes or log barns, they are superior to anything that you can cut down if you get it in good shape. When you're shopping for your logs, when you're shopping for vintage logs, you want to be able to find the best logs you possibly can, whether or not they're on your lot or they're vintage logs. And so it's a good idea to do some shopping as early as possible. Choose back and forth, see what's available, see how much it is. Learn what's good and what's bad. If you want to learn more about log cabins, come over and sign up for the Log Cabin Academy at handmadehouses.com. But anyway, when it comes to chestnut, let's see, we got the 4 categories that I'm going to cover in each of the species of wood is workability, rot resistance, insect issues, and attractiveness. And then I gave a 1 to 10 rating of each of it in my own personal opinion. So when it comes to chestnut workability, I gave it a whopping 10, and I didn't give a 10 to very many species of wood, but chestnut is just a real joy to work with, especially if you're a woodworker building something out of furniture where you're working with the lumber. It's also wonderful when you're notching a chestnut notches out on the log cabin or hewing them. They're absolutely, it works like butter. They're really sweet. It behaves. The grain doesn't go crazy other different directions. It's just that right need of effort put into the wood in order to make it do what you want to do with it. So workability is excellent. Rot resistance, I gave it a low 6, and that's kind of that'll probably throw you off a little bit, and that is that vintage people would often use chestnut for things like chestnut post in creating their fences, or put it on the bottom course of a home or whatever else. And because chestnut is known for rot resistance, but the reason why I gave it a 6 is because chestnut has a peculiar habit, and chestnut rots from the inside out rather than the outside in, like every other species of wood I know. And a lot of times that can really throw you off. And let me give you one example, and that is that I went to look at a salvageable chestnut log cabin that looked amazing. The folks sent me a picture of it, and it was just beautiful, and I went to take a look at it. and immediately something wasn't right about it, and that is I saw sawdust coming out of cracks here and there. And it didn't take me long to figure out that some of them were actually hollow. And then before long, by knocking on the wood, I found out they were all hollow. They were like straws of wood, where the logs themselves looked really good. But once you drilled a hole into it or cut a hole into it, suddenly it was nothing but wet, soggy sawdust that would come rolling out of the logs. It was amazing to me that the cabin was still standing with so little real wood left to it. So there was no salvageable value to it whatsoever. And so chestnut can be very deceptive when it comes to getting it. And be careful about that. And so the next issue that we come up to, the next category, is insect issues, whether or not it has it or not. And again, I'm going to give chestnut a positive 10 on this thing. And again, there's not many 10s I'm giving out today, but I have never seen an insect problem with chestnut. I just haven't. They're on the ground. I have seen chestnut rot, but I've never seen the insects have anything to do with chestnut. It's just a wonderful. It's a wonderful bug repellent species of wood. If you're concerned about bugs on your property, insects on your property eating your home, if you start out with a solid chestnut logs, you're not going to have bug issues. Period. You don't even need to spray for it. And then finally, the final category that I keep in mind is attractiveness. And here, chestnut, you're probably going to be a little surprised at this, but I'm giving it a low 6. And that is that chestnut. There was the time in history that go back 150 years ago, and supposedly one out of, I think it's like 4 trees in the mid-Atlantic states were chestnut growing wild. They were very large, branched out trees, and from what I understand, that when they were in bloom in the springtime with white flowers on it, that the mountains actually looked like there was snowfall on it. They were so gorgeous. And that people wouldn't really cut chestnuts very often, trees, because there was such an abundance of chestnuts themselves, which were delicious for humans to eat, but also for wildlife and pigs or whatever else. They were an abundant, tasty, highly nutritious food source as well. And then the blight came in. I think it was back in the 1920s. There was a disease that came in that basically almost entirely wiped out the chestnut tree population. And that's when most of the log cabins were built, was in that period that were using chestnut. A lot of times when I go look at chestnut, what I'm finding is relatively small logs, smaller than what I see back here, maybe like a 12-inch diameter. And the chestnut itself, the wood itself, when you're working with it, is absolutely beautiful. It's very similar to oak in its attractiveness, but it's much more enjoyable to work with. And I think it's more appealing than oak too, just slightly. But chestnut has a problem with its attractiveness, and that is that quite often it will feather or splinter or create multiple cracks in the wood. It's not a strokeable wood. It's not a wood where you'll see a chestnut log cabin and you'll want to go over and you want to, wow, this is beautiful. I just love this log cabin, because you'll end up with a handful of splinters in it. And so when it comes to actual beauty, chestnut is probably on the low end of what most wood would look like out there. And this before I close up here and everything else, I'd like to bring up one final point, and that is that when you go see a vintage log cabin, once they turn gray, once they lose some of that fresh wood appearance and everything else, pretty much a lot of the woods blend together. You really can't really tell the species of wood that clearly. Now, I can somewhat, because I've worked with them so much. Sometimes I'll actually see a chestnut log laying in the field and an oak one right next to it, and I won't be able to tell the difference between the oak and the chestnut. The only way I'll be able to tell the chestnut is if I pick it up, if I pick up one end of it, and that is chestnut weighs about half of what oak does. It's as soon as you pick that up, you know clearly what it is. Sometimes I'll have to take a chisel and I'll have to chisel off the face of it in order in order to determine what kind of species of wood it is. When you get that fresh wood appearance, it looks like that. And so this final point that I want to bring up, and that is that probably half of the vintage log cabins I have come across, the logs on them have been of multiple species, 2 or more different. And I'm sure when it was built, there was a difference in that, and people might have looked at it a little funny, but typically when a lot of the log cabins were built, particularly when it was country folks building their own home, not a team of craftsmen who would go around and build a log cabin, but if it was folks building their own home, and they had limited time and limited effort, that frequently what they do is they would pick the best trees that were close to the home, and that they would use those woods. So you'd end up with a mixture of wood, because that's what it was, rather than venturing, I'm going to determine nothing but oak and I'm going to go, a quarter mile that way, half a mile this way, in order to bring in nothing but oak. It would mix the species. And over time, again, they all blended down so that I don't think anyone has ever commented to me, wow, it looks like a mess with all these different species of wood in it, that no one can tell the difference between one and the other unless you have kind of a trained eye in order to do that. So anyway, that wraps it up for this episode. I look forward to seeing you in the next week's episode, where again, we're going to cover one of the species of wood most often used in vintage log cabins. So until then, we'll see you later. Bye now.